Hello, my name is John Collee. I've been doing a little bit of script assessment for Screen Australia. Obviously, Screen Australia gets sent hundreds of scripts every year, many by incredibly talented people. What's interesting is that most of the projects that are presented for financing, when they fail at the level of script. And beyond that, when the scripts fail, it's often at the level of simple storytelling. So we thought it would be useful for me just to go through some of the basic principles of script writing as an art form, as I understand it. And obviously, this is going to be very prescriptive. It's going to be stuff that a lot of you know already and don't need to be taught. But on the other hand, it may throw up a few pointers that stop you from making basic mistakes and help to get your projects greenlit by Screen Oz. The first thing really to ask is why we need made-up stories at all. There are hundreds of great TV episodes. We can never get through all the box sets that we've got to watch. And beyond that, there are news stories every day, and there are sporting events, all of which have characters, all of which have a beginning, a middle, and an end, all of which have highs and lows, peaks of excitement, troughs of despair. Why do we need made-up stories, and why do we need more of them in a world that's already awash with such things? And my answer to that is that we have an ongoing and deep desire for meaning in our lives. And the stories that we write are stories that contain meaning. This may seem completely self-evident, but I'd actually written 2 novels before I really got the message. And it happened 25 years ago, 20 years ago maybe, when I went to see a film that a friend of mine had made in London. His name was Roberto Pasolini. He was a young producer, and he'd made his first full-length feature. And he was very nervous about it. It had been made on a very low budget, and he was giving away tickets in the street in order to get people to come in and see his film. So I went in and watched it. And as Roberto had warned me, it was a little bit mawkish in places. It didn't have fantastically high production values. And it was a fairly simple and familiar story. But as I watched this movie, I found myself in tears. I wasn't alone in this. The whole audience responded well to it. The film went on to be a great success and eventually won an Oscar. That was The Full Monty. When I was analyzing afterwards what had been so effective at that story, I went through the story, much of which had very little in common with my own life. As you know, it's about a bunch of losers in a northern English town, all these men in denial, and they decide to put on a strip show to make money. And extraordinarily, the strip show is a huge success. And the final shot is of them all dropping their pants, and what you see from behind them is the audience erupting in applause. And that moment is incredibly poignant. Why is it poignant? Because of the meaning. The hidden meaning in that film is that we acquire power by revealing our weakness. And that is the secret of The Full Monty. That's why that film and many similar films came from nowhere and was a huge success, because the meaning that they have embedded in them is important to enough people that it acquires kind of universal resonance. The interesting thing about meaning is that it's like the maths in music. It's not apparent. That's the whole point. You're sucked into a film and the meaning kind of creeps up to you. You may not even go out of the film knowing anything more than that you were fantastically moved, but over time, the meaning will become apparent. The meaning of Slumdog Millionaire, also written by Simon Beaufoy, is that your wealth is your life experience, not your money. That film came out at the time of the global financial crisis, and that may be one reason why that particular piece of meaning was in the zeitgeist. But undeniably, another film that came from nowhere was a huge success because of the strength of the underlying meaning. The meaning of, say, The King's Speech. In a world now, kind of, as I said, awash with stories, nobody able to find their own voice. What The King's Speech taught us is that if you speak quietly and authentically, as if to people who you love, then your voice will reach millions. That was the message of The King's Speech. Again, that message irrespective of the virtues of the filmmaking, the great performances, all the other things that are needed to contribute to such a success, irrespective of that, the message, in my analysis, is what made the thing go viral. If you ask people to list their 10 favorite films, they're never necessarily the most accomplished pieces of work. They're the films that have the bit of meaning that resonate with that person at certain times in your life. If you were to list your 10 favorite films, you'll find a meaningful piece of information that comes into your life at exactly the right time, just when you need it. This is perhaps best articulated by the film Inception, which is a film about filmmaking. If you remember, here's a story about a bunch of people, a designer, an actor, a director essentially, whose job is to implant ideas in people's heads that the person didn't know they had. When Cobb is briefing Ariadne, he says to her, "I want you to design me a maze from which people can't get out to, and which feels incredibly real to them." And that maze is the plot. That's what we do. We design plots, we design stories, and in getting themselves out of the maze, in working their way through the story, the people acquire a piece of meaning which they didn't know they'd picked up along the way. And it is so profound and so personal to them that they think it's their own. That is basically, as I see it, the job of screenwriting. It's why screenwriting is so difficult, why so few films really succeed. But once you know it, then it gives you at least one of the tools that you need to write a great screenplay. Many of us try many times, and a lot of times we fail. But as long as you know that what your job is creating universal meaning, then at least you know what you're up against. I talked about the plot being like a maze. The idea, as you know, in education is that we learn things through doing. By finding our way out of a maze, by finding our way through a story, then we naturally sort of imbue the ideas in that story. It follows that there are three essential components of a good plot. The first is that the person we're going to be following through this maze, the avatar of ourselves, is somebody who we need to like or at least empathize with. This may seem completely self-evident, but there's so many Australian films that are written where the writer clearly mistakes conflict for drama. You don't necessarily need huge, gut-wrenching, shock, horror conflict to create drama. All that you need is somebody who you like and identifies with, who gets in a difficult situation. And really, it's more important to have someone we like and identify with than anything else. So that's the first principle. The second governing principle is that the story's got to make logical sense. Again, this must seem self-evident, but so many of the stories that are submitted, the films that are submitted, are beautifully written, full of fantastic complexity and research detail and so forth, but fall down on one or two little simple bits of logic. As I get to talking about plot, I'll describe how we go from sequence to sequence, and each sequence has a little hook that in overcoming one obstacle, you got to get to the next obstacle. But to avoid melodrama, the way that your central character needs to get from one sequence to the next needs to be a logical, conservative way to do it. You don't go into a corner shop and because they haven't got your paper, you pull out a gun and shoot the guy in the corner shop. You go into a corner shop, they don't have your paper, you go to the next corner shop. That's a logical, non-melodramatic link between two sequences of action. If you go for melodrama, then you've lost the audience. They wake up out of the dream, they leave the maze, and you've lost them. Okay, so part of the job is to make your plot incredibly logical. And the third essential feature of these mazes is that each maze is a story. It's got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Again, that may seem completely self-evident, but there are so many plots that get submitted to us which don't actually meet that simple criterion. There are many theories, of course, about how you construct a story. What is the universal model of a story? To me, there's really only one model worth thinking about, and that is the story of the cat up a tree. A guy has a cat of whom he's inordinately fond. The cat escapes and runs up a tree. In attempting to retrieve his cat, the guy or the woman has to go further and further out into the branches. And finally, in order to get his cat back, he or she has to do something which previously they would have found unthinkable. That's basically the three-act structure in a nutshell. There's a problem, there's a set of escalating complications, and finally, at the end of the second act, there's a transformative moment in which the hero or the heroine fundamentally changes their approach. And in that fundamental change of approach, we deliver the third act, which is the heartwarming, surprising, unpredictable, and memorable ending. And in that transformation of the character, hopefully we will be so embedded in that avatar, so embedded in that central character, that by the time we get to the end of the second act and they change, we change with them, and that is the moment of learning. This may all seem incredibly prescriptive, but if you read my currently favorite book on the theory of screenwriting, Into the Woods by John York, a very experienced BBC scriptwriter and script editor, he points out how all of the theorists of film writing, from Quentin Tarantino to Robert McKee, basically all come down with variations of that central principle. You need an empathetic central character, you need a logical progression, and you need a beginning, a middle, and an end. So how do you write such a film? How do you write a three-act structure? One of the things that I find useful is to think of film right from the beginning as being time constrained. We've got 100 minutes where the audience is essentially within our power when we can tell them a story. If you embrace that from the beginning, it's really helpful, because then you don't end up with 120 or 140 page scripts, which people know just by looking at it is never going to make a movie. You've got to get that down to 100 minutes or 100 pages, okay? Your first act is going to be about 20 minutes worth, because people are going to get bored if they get 20 minutes into the film and they don't know why they're watching this, what's happening, who they're following, or what this film is about, okay? So let's assume the first act is 20 minutes. The largest part of the film, your middle act, the escalating complications, is your second act, and that's going to be about 60 minutes long. And then you have to wrap it up in 20 minutes to half an hour as well. That gives you 100 minutes film. Again, I apologize if this seems prescriptive, but I'm describing how to make a film that is less likely to fail. Not the way you have to make your movie, but if we're reading a script and it's much more than 100 pages long, or if we're reading a script and by 20 pages you don't know what it's about, then it's probably a pass just from them. So these rules or guidelines are important. Going back to that idea that films are time constrained, when you see a film broken up as kind of viewing segments on the DVD, it generally breaks it into 3-minute sequences. The bit where, the car chase, the confrontation, the da-di-da. These sequences may consist of several scenes, but they're identifiable blocks of 2 to 3 minutes, and that's what I start with. I start building up the blocks of my story from the beginning through to the end. To even start a story, you need a vast amount of information. One of the paradoxes of this job is that you have to have a huge amount of research resource and condense it down into something that's structurally quite simple. So on one hand, you're building up your folder of research notes. You might go to books, you might, as I frequently recommend, you might try and experience something like what is happening in your movie, so that you've actually embedded in your consciousness, in your way of seeing the world. You know how these characters would see the world. You can't write an action sequence, for example, without being in the place, or at least being surrounded by something like the action that's going to take place. And then you know how you process it, you know how it would look in the camera, you know how it might be shot, you know all the potential of things that might happen, and that's all great ammunition, okay? Now you start writing down your sequences. Keep it simple to start with. Here's my beginning, here's my middle, here's my end. I'm now writing down cards, like these palm cards, and a lot of you probably use these already. I give each palm card a title, the bit where, and I start just throwing them on the table. And we might, if I'm working with a director or a collaborator, we might end up with 50 or 60 of these cards. We know we're only going to be able to use 30 of them. And then we start arranging the cards in a sequence, 1 to 30 or 1 to 40. And as we arrange them, we start telling each other the story verbally. There's an idea that you have to keep stories secret, that you have to just sit at your typewriter and write them down. It all happens inside your head. And I think that's completely false. I think that stories evolve when you tell them. If you've ever pitched stories to producers, then you'll know that you're getting so much subconscious, subliminal feedback from somebody who's listening to your story. So the more you tell it to your friends, to your family, to your loved ones, to other filmmakers in your team, the more you tell it aloud, the better it'll get. And as you tell it aloud, just from the reaction of people who are listening to it, you'll start to see which of your cards are unnecessary and which are essential. And these cards can get folded together, one on top of the other, or all of these bits can be in this one sequence, or they can get spread out. This sequence needs to be 3 sequences. But you can actually then tell your story in a 10-page document made of these 30 or 40 cards. You can tell your story, these 30 or 40 headings, and that is the long-form treatment. And to me, that's the essential document. A screenplay is perhaps 30,000 words. A 10-page treatment is 3,000 words. It's a brilliant way to summarize your film because people can read a treatment really easily. When you get stuck on the plot, you can give it to them. People will read it in in 20 minutes and tell you what feels wrong with that story. If you give them a script, they'll have it for a month and they won't get around because it's a whole evening's work. And also, the bones of the actual skeleton of the plot will be disguised by all the great writing you've done. You've got to give them just the pure story, just who does what to whom and why. Okay, and summarize it with titles for each one and break it down, get it down to about 10 pages. I'll often see treatments that are 40 pages long, full of fantastic detail, but the detail is just obscuring the story. A story that's much shorter than 10 pages tends to be very telegraphic, and you can't actually see what all the kind of psychological kind of logic of it is. But in 10 pages, you can summarize most movies, and if the 10 pages are no good, then the script's going to be no good. Once I've got my 10-pager with headings, which will look something like this, starts with the doomed aircraft, a little bit of description there. The next passage I've entitled the job offer, a little bit of description there, all my way through to sort of sequence 30 in the end. Alongside that, I'll have a whole sheaf of research notes. So each of these little 3-minute things in which I describe the essential content of each 3-minute sequence in the film will all be backed up with a bunch of research and stuff that I can put into the script. And then I write the first draft of the script, and I write it generally pretty quickly, having embedded all the experiences from the research, all the reading from the research, having embedded the whole structure of where this story is going, and hopefully by now, hopefully but not necessarily, have worked out the theme. Then I just start writing. And you can write a screenplay easily in 2-3 weeks to a month. Easily, just bash it out. Just give yourself 5 or 10 pages a day and bash it out. Don't look back, just go to the end. And then read it, and then summarize it again. Because when you're writing fast, then you put in a whole lot of things you hadn't thought of before. But these then need to be incorporated into the skeleton of the story. So I keep on going back to this treatment. I'll write my draft, and then I'll summarize what I've written. And I'll look at that, and I'll rearrange it, and I'll tweak it, and I'll show it to other people, I'll retell it to other people, and then I'll write my second draft. Same way, load up on information, bash it out, then summarize it, and then read the summary. And finally, as your script draft's going to pile up and your summaries pile up, you will end on the top of the pile with a summary that absolutely nails the story and the theme and the story that you're telling, of 10 pages long, that anyone can read and decide on whether this is a film they want to make, and at the same time, a 100-page script that is ideally unputdownable from beginning to end. So that's my technique. Good luck with it.